Good evening. Thank you so much for coming to our panel discussion about how and why a new play that is opening, that just opened last night here at Trinity Rep. I'd like to, the panel is called She Blinded Me with Science, which is very humorous, I believe. We'd first like to thank the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities for helping to sponsor this panel. Without their support, it would be hard to do this kind of thing. And I also would stress that any opinions expressed, any thoughts, any ideas or conclusions that we may come up with are not from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. It's purely from the individuals that express them. I had to say it. Videotaped. But thank you so much for being here. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel. I will say that a lot of times I have to moderate discussions, and I'm generally not the smartest person on the panel anyway. But in this case, I am definitely not the smartest by any means. It's really my pleasure. They actually have detailed bios, which I'm actually going to read from right now. Okay. So Dr. Carson, Dr. Sandra Carson. She is in charge of clinical activities of assisted reproductive technology procedures, gynecological treatments, recurrent spontaneous abortion and surgery. An accomplished surgeon, she has designed surgical instruments for hysteroscopic surgery. How would I say that? There are so many words that I'm not with. She has been recognized for her clinical expertise in Best Doctors in America for more than 10 years and is included regularly in Good Housekeeping's 401 Best Doctors for Women, Rhode Island's Top Doctors list, the Guide to America's Top Obstetricians and Gynecologists by the Consumers Research Council of America, and Castle County's America's Top Doctors. Her latest research development, the Women and Infants Brown Artificial Human Ovary, was chosen as one of the top 10 medical breakthroughs in 2010 by Time Magazine. Give her a round of applause. That's amazing. Sohini Ramachandran completed her bachelor's in applied mathematics and her doctorate in biology at Stanford University and did her postdoctoral work at Harvard University before joining the faculty of Brown in 2010. Her research focuses on the relative roles of historical processes in natural selection in shaping genetic variation among humans living today. She has been profiled in Nature and The Scientist as a scientist to watch and is a Sloan Research Fellow and a Pew Scholar in the biomedical sciences. Give her a round of applause. Shana Gozansky.
I'm so glad I'm not last.
Shana Gozansky is the director of How and Why. She holds an MFA in directing from the Brown University Trinity Rep MFA program, a BA in theater arts from Bard College, was an artist in residence at Shashama. And the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, is a member of the Lincoln Center Theater Directors Lab and is a Drama League Directing Fellow. These are all very impressive. Please give her a round of applause. Kay Warren is the Charles Tillinghast Jr. Class of 32 Professor, International Studies, and Professor of Anthropology at Brown University. She received her Ph.D. in Cultural Anthropology from Princeton and served on the senior faculties of Princeton and Harvard before coming to Brown in 2003. At Brown, Warren is a member of the Anthropology Department and directs the Pembroke Center, which pursues interdisciplinary research across the humanities and social sciences on new generations of issues that cross-cut critical and feminist theory, transnationalism, and difference. Give her a nice round of applause. My name is Dobrowsky. I directed Christmas Carol. Good. All right. What the structure for the panel is, I'm going to ask a number of questions. For probably the first half or so, we are going to talk a little bit about the play, a little bit about the science behind the play, a little bit about being a woman in a male-dominated field, both in the sciences as well as in the theater. And then after that, we're going to open it up and take questions from you. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Make sure that if you do have a question, raise your hand, and then when I call on you, speak in a nice, loud voice so that we can all hear you. I will most likely repeat the questions, but just so that we can all hear, make sure you speak nice and loud. So those are the rules, that's the structure. Let's get to it. Shana.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how and the why, for those of us that have not yet seen the play? Can you talk a little bit about what the play is about? And then, if you can, talk a little bit about the two theories that the two women in the show bring about.
Me talking about this theory? All right. Fortunately, I have backup for this series. The How and the Why is a relatively new play by Treem, who just had a baby this weekend.
Wow.
Congrats to her. That was originally produced at the McCarter. It is about, and is sort of making the round, obviously. Best version is here. And Korean, very Kreinik. It's about two women, both evolutionary biologists, and what you find out, this is not a huge spoiler, is that they're biological mother and daughter. And they're meeting for the very first time. And it's a real confrontation between sort of them reckoning with the result of this woman's choice to give up her child, but also a confrontation of their ideas of generational differences on perspective. And throughout the course of the play, what you see happen is how this shared language of science and this shared interest becomes the conduit for which they actually start to discover what their relationship as mother and daughter is, can be, won't be, you know, the unknowns of it. But they use this language as sort of a mechanism to investigate a more personal relationship. That kind of breaks it down.
Yeah,
all right,
great.
Thanks. So the two theories that are stated in the play are menstruation as a defense against toxicity of sperm. And the younger woman in the play, Rachel Hardiman, is a grad student at NYU, and she has this very sort of radical theory that the reason that women menstruate every month is to cleanse the uterus of sperm, as sperm is a pathogen. And on the flip side of that, Zelda, who is her mother, has a theory called the grandmother hypothesis, and essentially that hypothesis is states that the reason women live longer and sort of go through menopause and live longer is in order to, and I don't know if I have the order of this right, ladies, it basically created childhood and therefore humanity. That because women back in the day, in the sort of Pleistocene era, had, like really back in the day, childbearing women they were either constantly pregnant or post-pregnancy, that grandmothers, like the aging woman, evolved to help those children that are sort of toddler age continue to grow up, so the childbearing aged women could continue to be pregnant and have kids. I think we'll get into more details about that later.
Yeah, sure.
Great.
But thank you, Shana. Yeah, thank you. And out of curiosity, how many people have seen the play already? Okay. Oh, good. Great. How many people have not yet seen the play? Oh, all right. Oh, nice split. I think the treatment, the way that the characters and the way that the play is written, the way that the characters talk about their theories, especially Zelda when talking about the grandmother hypothesis, it's really actually kind of beautiful. And even her daughter, after Zelda explains the hypothesis, she says that's a really beautiful theory, Zelda, because it speaks to how we develop as people, like how we developed, how we have childhood, and how childhood kind of gave us humanity. So I guess my next question, and Sohini, I'm going to throw this at you, is how does we'll start with the grandmother hypothesis. Now, that's a real thing, right? Okay, good. And does it hold water? How long has it been around for? Is it generally accepted as a valid hypothesis?
So I think the history of the hypothesis is really well presented in the play. It was first put forward in the 1950s by a scientist named George Williams, who is mentioned in the text of the play. It was then further popularized by a scientist named Bill Hamilton, who studied processes of sexual selection and sexual dimorphism, questions about why the peacock has his tail and things like that. And then I think that Zelda's work, which is with a nomadic tribe in Africa called the Hadza, who are hunter-gatherers, is modeled off of a female anthropologist named Kristen Hawkes, who teaches at the University of Utah. And she did that work in the field in the 1980s and 90s, where she went to this community that lives mostly the way we imagine that ancestors of all modern humans lived in Africa before the great human diaspora out of Africa about 80,000 years ago. And she observed that older women were very invested in helping their offspring raise their offspring. So this was seen as validating the grandmother hypothesis. Now I would say that the hypothesis is still very commonly taught. It's a theory that any evolutionary biology student would learn. And I think nowadays we use it to think a lot about social structures and caregiving structures and why these might evolve in humans and how our sociality as a species has really helped us become the species that we are, living in all possible habitable environments in the world. A lot of people like Bill Hamilton also study the way that primates and birds set up different caregiving systems and how that might help offspring survive. There's a trade-off that's talked about in the play between the cost of investing in gestating an offspring, especially as you get older, versus investing in the care of those around you who are related to you. So I would say that it is still taught. It does hold water to an extent. The biggest questions about it are, one, the field work that was done on observing the Hadza wasn't, an experimental process. We can't experiment easily on humans, so it wasn't like anthropologists could go into a community and take grandmothers away from families and then how is this family going to do in the long term? That wasn't really a question. But another question is about the genetic underpinnings of aging and menopause. So there's a kind of chicken and egg problem. The problem is so let's think back to the first grandmother who evolves to live post her reproductive years. If that has some genetic underpinning, then natural selection would see that, and evolution might happen. That might be adaptive. But the question is to what extent that would be adaptive at a young age. So I guess the question is living into old age something that you need a grandmother for that to happen, or if it's genetically mediated, or were these children going to live into old age anyway? So it's kind of hard to know. That's the biggest question of grandmother hypothesis.
It really is. It's a fascinating, because I had honestly not thought about it too much until I read the play about a year and a half ago, and then seeing it, I feel like it does raise a lot of questions that I hadn't really thought about. Now, Sandra, for the other hypothesis, if you want to talk about the grandmother hypothesis, go right ahead. But for the other hypothesis, that menstruation as a defense, that is not as well accepted, right? As a theory that is totally valid, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
And I think it actually blends two theories, but coming back, I'm not sure that the grandmother hypothesis is totally well accepted either. Mm-hmm. And the largest problem, as I see with it, is that, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so these investigators went to the Hadza and they looked at caretaking and nurturing and gestation, really focusing on the women. And in our culture, as well as their culture, of course, and biologically, women have babies, they gestate, they breastfeed. But they forgot about the grandfathers. There's a lot of contributions that grandfathers make gathering food, giving economic resources, and so they kind of missed a big portion there. So that makes me wonder about that hypothesis also. And secondly, if you're really talking about way back when in biology, if you think about it, the first baby, now menstruation was a little bit later, probably about age 16, 18. So just for easy math, let's say it was at 20. The first baby's at 20, that means the grandmother would be 40, right, by the time that happened. So at age 40, probably now the species didn't live quite as long, but still, she probably had enough energy. And so we might be talking about the great-grandmother. So there's a lot of issues with that hypothesis that maybe needs a little work. Now coming back to the menstruation theory, I mean, long ago it was thought that menstruation was a way to get toxins out of the body. And many of us actually who are my age might have had their mothers tell us about menstruation by saying, well, finally you'll get all that poison out. And that was a common explanation of early menstrual period. And it was thought that it did relieve the body of some toxins. However, menstruation doesn't have much to do with the uterus per se, except the effect. It is really a reflection of what the ovary tells it to do. Now, the uterus is a wonderful organ. It's big and it increases its volume 1,000 times and then pumps out a 7-pound baby. I mean, the heart gets a little bit bigger and it fails, So, same muscle. But despite that, it's not a real smart organ, and it just kind of responds to the hormones that the ovary produces. And so menstruation is really just a response of the ovary ovulating, producing hormones, and then stopping in the absence of pregnancy, and then having the lining shed. So menstruation is really simply a secondary effect. The reason that it probably isn't protective against sperm is because actually during menstruation, at least in this country, couples tend to have intercourse less often than at other times during the menstrual cycle for a variety of reasons. And in fact, so when they actually have sex and the sperm is up in the uterus and up in the reproductive tract, menstruation is already gone or about to happen. So that the timing is off then too. And then the second issue is that probably this old theory of getting rid of toxins is combined with something that we do know, and that is sperm do take bacteria up into the upper respiratory, or I'm sorry, up into the, sorry. That's what it is. In the upper reproductive tract. And women are more likely to get infections in the upper reproductive tract during menstruation rather than at other times. So there's kind of on two faults that's probably not the best of theory.
Right. Now, and Shana, you and your cast also did a little bit of research, I assume, before.
I did.
Yeah, I hope this much. Yeah.
Scotch.
So I suppose, what did you find in your own research? So, did you investigate particular people, particular scientists who worked on these theories?
Marjorie Prophet is a young scientist who Google her because it's a fascinating story. She was a young scientist who basically came up with this idea of menstruation as a pathogen cleansing process. But she also has other theories of allergies as part of a pathogen clearing process, which that theory is actually gaining some momentum and steam as possibly being true, or having some legitimacy to it. The menstruation one never really caught on. And then she also had another very controversial but very popular when it first came out theory that morning sickness had to do with the body naturally telling a woman what food she should and shouldn't eat. But that got a lot of, there was some derision about that because sometimes morning sickness has to do with vegetables, and so a lot of doctors were very concerned that it would be that pregnant women wouldn't be getting enough nutrients if this theory really caught on. So she was sort of a rebel and really unapologetic about the validity of these theories. And then she disappeared for a while, and nobody knew where she went. And she was gone for, Emily, do you remember, like a decade? Yeah. She like truly Emily is a literary intern and helped out with the play dramaturgically and as assistant director and brought in a lot of research for us. And Marjorie disappeared for about 10 years, and nobody really knew why. And then there was a magazine article researching her, and she recently resurfaced because of that article. And she was someone who came in as a rebel and ended up not necessarily being able to take the heat of what these radical theories kind of led to in terms of the pushback from the scientific community. And so Sarah Treem was inspired by Marjorie's story, and that's sort of where Rachel Hardiman comes from. And then we looked a lot at the original research by Williams and Hawks, and had fun reading those, / paging through looking up words.
Now, Kay, this play deals with two women in a very male-dominated field, but they also come from two different generations. In your work, you've done a lot of research, and you have a lot of experience as far as talking about not only different waves of feminism, but also just sort of women in academia. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure. The women in academia is just participant observation, I guess. I want to refer first to the play, though, because I love this play. And I see heads going up and down. And the thing I love about it is the wordplay and the arguments that go on. So you hear these women across generations just really cleverly slaughtering each other. It's really, it's like swords crossing. The other thing is they're hysterically funny. It's as if they talk from two different universes. And they sort of, this miscommunication is very much a part of the play. It's a richness, really engaging part. Well, as an anthropologist, what I do is I look at the larger social context and ask, how would they shape the experiences of these two women? And how can we think of that, in fact, not as mechanical products, but as sort of creative responses to being born at different times. And if you look at, I'm going to do a little waves of feminism here. We all know the first wave of feminism, right? 1920, women got the vote. 19th Amendment, let's not forget that. Okay, well that's the long history. In this case, we're really looking at the second wave of feminism, which happened in the late 60s, very end of the 60s, and in the 70s. I've now become the class historian. And I can tell you from personal experience, but in this play, what happens is, Zelda is very much a product of that, although she comes on the scene a little later. It's early 80s that is really when she emerges. But here is a woman who has this passion for science and wants to become a wonderful original science and get acclaim for it. She's totally dedicated to her work. And above all, it's very clear, in fact, that she's growing up at a time where you've had a sexual revolution. She's omnivorous in terms of sexual activity, but it's all a hobby to her because her real life is the life of a research scientist. And that's what she's willing to sacrifice almost anything to reach that. Well, the conditions of possibility for women at that period in the 70s were really shaped by factors that really forced women, pressured women to really give of themselves in this particular way. In order to get into the sciences, you had to face the fact that there simply were not many women before this time. So this was the second wave of feminism, where there was a wider clamor for opening up non-traditional jobs for women, for opening up education to women. A lot of these Ivy League schools that had been single sex suddenly were becoming co-educational. There were more women in graduate programs. So a whole bunch of issues, and besides that, reproductive issues were very much a part of this part of feminism. So controlling your reproduction, being sexually active was part of this. So a whole bunch of these streams of social change that come. Oh, and how about equal pay for equal work? That was very much a key part of this. So here is Zelda, someone who's grown up during this historical period, and she's taken this challenge literally. She said, I want to be a scientist. I'm going to give my life to this. The life of the mind is wonderful. She gets into academics, and remember, this is a time when in typical elite schools, you would have of the tenured faculty that really had jobs for good, not well, I went to Princeton when I was brought on the faculty there. 97% of the faculty was male, and 3% was female. So when you start feeling the heaviness of that, guess who's going to mentor a young woman? It's going to be the male scientist in this. So you can begin to imagine the environment in which she grew up, and she became part of that. And you can begin to fathom why. Oh, the other thing that I have to tell you from experience is that there was great ambivalence about women having children, women professors. I see lots of heads going up. There really was that you weren't committed. If you said that was your plan in a job interview, you really hurt your chances of getting the job in the late 60s. I'm not saying these were patterns for everyone. It wasn't a global pattern, but these were very strong tendencies. So you can see why someone would sacrifice themselves for this line of success and do all kinds of things to foster that. Well, she meets up with this younger woman. What happens? She's in a totally different generation of these feminists changed. And it's this much more contemporary one where the kids are more laid back. They're looking for balance in life. They're looking for lifelong loves, but not necessarily married. That's a new hybrid kind of idea. And so for her, the idea of sharing is abstract for these meetings, sharing her great breakthrough idea that may make her famous with her boyfriends to cement that relationship. It doesn't work, but she tries, right? Is her strategy as a young person to create balance in her life. For Zelda, this is an abomination, that you would share work and take the credit for yourself, and not take the credit for yourself, but give it to a boyfriend. Like, that's the last thing in the world. It's incommensurable. It's like a foreign language. It's like talking to a Martian. So you get this kind of you really do. You get this kind of tension. And it really is about history. It's about, they're not mechanical products, but they were shaped by really different conditions. That they, in fact, end up talking to each other, I think, better over time. And the mentoring thing, I know you're going to talk about soon, but that there's a mentor kind of relationship that starts to grow up, I think gives us great hope for better communication across these abysses.
Yes, you brought up the mentor-mentee. P.S., how smart are these people, honestly? I wish I could bring you to Thanksgiving dinner. But you brought up the mentor-mentee dynamic that is present in the play, because they sort of shift between estranged mother and daughter and then mentor-mentee. You know, they they relatively fluidly fluctuate between those two things. One question I have, and we can just kind of go down the road, is how important is having a mentor in your field? How important is it to be a mentor? Especially given that sciences and also theater can be a male-dominated field. So what do you think?
Well, yes and yes. I mean, I think that I've been lucky to have amazing mentors. And my most direct mentors in graduate school and in college and after college have been, and mentoring is really important to me. What I would say is that the relationship between the graduate student and the advisor in science is a very intense kind of apprenticeship. It can really make or break your career. It's really important to have a mentor who's an advocate, who's looking out for you professionally, introducing you to opportunities to communicate your science, giving you credit for your work, someone you can talk to about the ways you want to develop professionally. And one thing that I think the play sort of touches on a little bit that is interesting, I think, for young people in science and for women in science is identifying good mentors and identifying sets of mentors. I think sometimes what I notice in students is a predisposition to look for mentors who seem very similar to their own personal background, whether that has to do with being first generation from another country, same gender, or having the same research interests. And I think that what I always tell students and what really helped me was having mentors who have experience mentoring. So, what I found is that I had these excellent male mentors, and they had this history of training people who were going on into academics, which is what I wanted to do. They had colleagues who didn't have the same, sort of academic progeny, didn't have a lot of trainees, and I think also finding sets of people that you talk to about different aspects of your career, and this is something that, just if we kind of read in the paper, we might see often articles about, men kind of coming into that more often in their careers. There's sort of a bunch of people that they're talking to about career development, whereas whereas women might try to find all of that in one person. So that can be a kind of a challenge, I think.
Anthropologists are more individualistic, I think, than all of it. We go up to 14,000 feet on our own and just do our thing. And we don't work in labs, so this collective work in labs to me is absolutely fascinating. However, I have a couple of mentees, I won't out anyone here, in the audience of different generations, and it's really fun to be a mentor. So I had no mentors growing up. I was in the first class of Ph.D. students at Princeton in anthropology, and the faculty was just like 5 years older than we were. What are they doing? But when it was my turn to become one, it's just wonderful. And so I can really, see that kind of relationship. It is a kind of kinship. You are hopefully friends for a really long time. You're writing letters of recommendation for decades, let me tell you. And hopefully when you retire, they throw you a party. But I do think that in this play, you would take this very fraught, very vulnerable relationship that is unlikely to succeed because of the anger, right, that Rachel feels about being dumped at 6 days old. But you can replace that with another kind of relationship if you can't fix the mother-daughter thing, and that is the mentor-mentee, which allows the daughter to be more of an adult. But let me tell you one thing, there's no end to psychology. I am not a psychoanalytically inclined person. However, this one, there's one moment, remember those of you who've seen it, when Zelda just hangs Rachel out to dry. She doesn't tell her what academic meetings are like when you're presenting your new ideas. She just lets her fly. And it's an extraordinarily mean thing to do, but I guess there were some accounts to be settled in both directions there. But you also see in the play the hopeful, better kind of mentorship, where there really is this communication and this sort of mutual aid, and the older person is showing people the way down the path. The only nice way I can interpret this, when Zelda doesn't tell her that she's going to be attacked, of course you're going to be attacked with a new idea in these meetings, is just that she took it for granted as part of her culture, that it's a rough and tumble field. You present your new hypothesis and everyone just gangs up and smashes you. And that's just the culture. And if you can hold that sort of anthropological understanding, then you can get Zelda out of trouble by saying, she just figured everyone knew that. And there's more, Rachel who's just walking around, this is all new to her. So you can, if you're an optimist or a pessimist, you can choose.
I just saw it differently, that I think that she was giving Rachel the opportunity to plant her flag and say, this is mine, before somebody else kind of honed in.
I think that's certainly the case. But I think if I had a student who was going off to a meeting who had not been experienced in getting attacked in a meeting, I would have said, listen, there are going to be some hostile people out here, so let's talk for a moment about how you respond when people are very hostile and how you stand up for yourself. Because if you're not ready, you can really get just slaughtered, and you're just standing there, like a rabbit in front of a headlight or something. You just don't know how to respond, and then later you really regret that you did not stand up for yourself. That's why a good mentor is going to warn mentees about tough stuff coming.
Sandra, do you want to talk just a little bit about mentors and mentees?
Well, I'm not sure if you know who Mentor was. Mentor is a character in the Odyssey by Homer. And Odysseus was off to war. His wife had died, and he entrusted his son, Telemachus, to mentor, and asked him to make his son just like Mentor himself, guide him and lead him and make him the same man as Mentor. And he went off to war, and 22 years later, they met up again. And Mentor did a great job, because Telemachus was every man, or all the man that Odysseus would have wanted him to be. So it's interesting in this play, here's a woman who has gifted her child to adoption because she obviously felt she couldn't take care of her in the way that she would want her daughter to be cared for. And gifted her to probably a couple that we don't find anything about who did take care of her so successfully that in fact they made her the man that her mother was, both an evolutionary biologist. So, and I think in science we do this to our mentees as well. We care for them very much like we care for children. They're our academic family. But I think that it depends on both the mentor and the mentee, what they bring in terms of expectations to that relationship. It's having many fellows and many mentees, and having two sons. The mentee-mentor role is a lot easier. But I've had a lot more training for it too. But it's very similar, and you still have to be sometimes give a lot of tough love to that. And you do have an investment, just like you invest in your child, to your protege, if you will, and you want them to do well. And in a sense, passing everything that you have had forward to them is what I personally feel a mentor should do. Mentees have different expectations from that relationship, and I think that whatever those two bring to an expectation is what ends up resulting in that relationship.
Sure. Hi. Let's talk about the theater part. So in theater, mentorship is hugely important. The only reason I'm a director is because I had a mentor who said you should direct. And I said, no, I'm going to be a great actor. And he said, it's weird that you come to rehearsal when you're not called and that you want to meet the designers. You really should direct. And had he not said that to me when I was 21, I, however many years later, would not be here today. And it was his mentorship that sort of sparked a sea change in my career as a theater artist. As a director, you often assistant direct, which means you're in the room on productions. What that can sometimes be an observership. Sometimes that's actually you have an actual creative role in the production itself. But either way, you are being invited into a very personal experience experience with a director, and that is a huge part of the mentorship and the growth and the learning of being a director. And then having just come out of graduate school across the street at Brown Trinity, I had so many mentors. It's extreme, you know. You're surrounded by a faculty and people in this building who so much of their focus is mentoring you to become the best individual artist you can be. And it gets heated, and you get to fight about things and have great artistic disagreements, and know at the end of the day, it's all there for the betterment of everybody. I believe mentoring, even when you feel like you might not be ready for it, is really important because I think it teaches you a lot. I think that there is something about being responsible in some ways, or being a person that is trusted that when someone comes to me for advice, that's a responsibility, and it also puts me in a position where I have to reflect on my own experiences and actually say the thing that I mean to say, as if you can't be flippant about it. And I think that it teaches you a lot about what your own perspective and worldview is, and allows you some distance to process your experiences. So I think it becomes this really weird, beautiful two-way street of, and I think it gets very close. I think when you're, especially, I don't know if this is the same in your field, but in theater, I think you have to surrender to the mentor and fall in love with them a little bit, and really believe in what they're doing artistically, so that you can get as much as you can from them, and then you have to be critical of those things. And so it's a thrilling relationship that is absolutely necessary for theater to keep growing and changing.
We have laws against that.
And I want to open it up in just a second, but Shana, I did want to talk I wanted to touch a little bit about female playwrights. I mean, this play is obviously written by a woman, and how, generally speaking, a lot of female playwrights are not produced as frequently as men. Can you just talk just a little bit about that? And also why it's important for theaters to produce female playwrights?
Yes. I'm going to solve all these questions.
Yeah, good.
So this year, I think it's TCG does the 11 most produced playwrights in the country. And this year, 1 out of the 11 was a woman, and the rest were men. And I think that's a pretty sad breakdown.
TCG is the Theater Communications Group, which is kind of a body that investigates and offers grant opportunities for theaters across the country.
They're like the mothership. And Time Out New York did some of you might have heard me say this before, Time Out New York did a breakdown of 20 shows to see this fall, and 18 of them were directed by men and 2 were directed by women. And no one talked about that, which I found interesting. Yeah. They sort of just accepted, yes, those are the shows to see, and isn't that exciting? So I think theater is still trying to engage with the diversity question. I think one of the reasons it is important for women playwrights to be produced more often is we are in contention with the theatrical canon, which is primarily driven by men. So Shakespeare is one of the most produced playwrights, and he's a guy, and a very good one. But when you're dealing with the canon itself, and when theaters program classics, they're looking at Shakespeare and Chekhov and Ibsen and Shaw and Arthur Miller and Mamet, and you're getting into the modern canon, and all of a sudden, where are the women? And so I think it's very important for theaters to take a responsibility for addressing that issue, because until women playwrights start to get presented more, they will always be considered the woman's play as opposed to just a play. And that's a problem, in my opinion. Like this play, it talks about toxicity of sperm and menstruation, and it's a woman's play. But actually, it's about so much more than that, and I think it's a disservice to sort of compartmentalize plays as, for women or for, and that no one says Arthur Miller is for men. think that it's important in terms of diversity, and I would say it's the same thing is true for playwrights of color and different ethnic backgrounds. I think that in general, there's a lot of work to be done so that it doesn't become a specialty or like a special slot, but it's just another thing in the continuum. Soapbox.
Great, that was wonderful. So now I wanted to give an opportunity for you to ask our panel some questions. Yep, right over here. Again, I'm going to repeat the question, but try to say it nice and loud.
Well, actually, I have two, and I'll make them quick. One is, how common is menstruation in other mammals and other species? And the other is there a categorization of a theory about evolution so that sort of gives us as to how important that characteristic was in the evolution? So, for example, might longevity have come along just because it was associated with something else that was important in the evolution?
So the first question is menstruation in other animals, and how often do they menstruate? And then the second question was about longevity and evolution, is that correct? Just to make sure that I understand it.
So I probably can't clarify the second question. I just want to know sort of how you know whether longevity and the fact that grandmothers and grandfathers were there in the family was a sort of essential to the evolution of the species, or just came along with something else that was essential.
Well, you know, not very many animals live past menopause. There are only 3 that I know of. One is the human, one's the pilot whale, and another species of whale. Now, I have no idea who figured out that whales don't live past. Did we have a whale with a hot flash? Picture there. But supposedly those are the only 3 species that are known to have that one. So, and it's not really the end of menses per se that's important, but rather it's the end of reproductive life. And in fact, when you apparently, even when I think gorillas, maybe apes, gorilla, one primate, I think it's gorillas, are castrated and then returned to the wild, they die very shortly thereafter. So, and certainly, but why that is less clear. But throughout the ages, the age of puberty and the onset of menstruation has decreased. Women are younger than ever when they start their periods. However, the age of menopause has remained fairly constant throughout the centuries. So I'm not sure what that means. But the extension is not menopause per se, but rather how long we're living afterwards. And so probably evolutionarily, reproductive life is set, and what's happening is we are able to live longer afterwards. One of the things about the play that I think is very dangerous is the fact that there's some suggestion that estrogen causes breast cancer. It has been shown that estrogen does not, and significantly prevents a lot of the problems that occur after menopause because of no estrogen. And so, and that is one thing, one treatment that we have had, and there's very new evidence out that's not yet even published showing that estrogen will actually, when given in a particular 6-year period after menopause, will actually prevent heart disease. And so there's a window of time that's very important. And those are medical advancements that we have had to extend that luxury, that evolutionarily I'm not sure that will make a difference because it's not in our biology per se.
Yeah, to take a stab at the second question, I would say that the 2 theories in the play highlight something really important about the way we think about human evolution. And this is assuming that a trait is adaptive because we see it. And that's really common for us to do when we're thinking about ourselves. We live in an anthropocentric world, and when we look at the way that our world is structured, it really seems like man is in control of a lot of things. We have a lot of technologies, we can live a long time. People in the community that we're in, we have access to modern medicine. So I just want to say that the way you phrased your question, the second question, is a really nice way of phrasing it, because one thing this play doesn't touch on is the idea that not every trait that we might see that seems special to us was maybe an adaptive trait or something that was selected for in evolutionary history. Longevity specifically, survival past reproductive age, is something that classical Darwinian selection sort of doesn't care about. I mean, the real way that classical natural selection operates is to allow certain genotypes or certain genetic makeups to survive disproportionately to reproductive age. But how long we live, which is of huge importance to us socially, the quality of life that we have and how long the average person can live, is really important to our society. But that doesn't really have to do with selection and evolution. So that kind of interfaces with what Sandra was saying. And to give you an example of something that, well, this isn't a great example, something might look adaptive and isn't, but one sort of classic question about a human trait that isn't really necessary are nipples on men. So this is an example of something that exists, and we don't, why, people might ask why. And really that has to do with the byproduct of the fact that sexual differentiation for embryos doesn't happen in our gestation until around after 7 weeks post-conception. So the structure is a vestige of the fact that an embryo could become female, in which case having nipples and a mammary gland and things become really important. So I can't think of a better example about like a human-specific trait that isn't sex-specific, but often there might be things like menstruation where we have this impulse to say, oh, there must be a reason for this, when really it could just be the loss of something else.
Thank you.
Yep, right there.
I'm going to try and ask this so that the people who haven't seen the play don't need a spoiler alert. But there's obviously, the play opens with the question of the choice that Zelda made in keeping her child or giving her away. But as the play progresses, you learn more about that choice. So what I'd like to know is if any of you, I'm assuming, Shana, you probably have, thought about what if she had made the other choice? What if she had stayed with the father in that time of history? Where would both her and her daughter's life be at this point in the play?
This is where I wish Annie Scaria were here.
She would have slapped her soon.
Yeah. It's such an interesting question because it's so hard to imagine Zelda. I mean, I think what Sarah does so successfully in the play is it makes it hard to imagine Zelda doing that at all. I think it would have been really hard for Zelda to live in that construct. I think she would, so much of this play to me, and this play has like 90 scenes in it that I keep coming back to as I see it and rereading it, and so much of it has to do with what ambition is and what it does and what the hunger to discover, how that drives you. It's, there are moments in this play where I think this is just about art. I mean, this is just like, these are conversations that I have with my, artist friends too. So it's hard to imagine a woman with that much ambition and that much belief in herself and her idea, sort of subjugating that. I think for her it would have been a subjugation to the father, and I think it would have been very painful for her. I think it would have been weirdly a lonely life for her, and I think she picked the life that felt less lonely. So,
Any of the other panelists have a thought about that?
I just think it's pre-daycare.
also that.
I don't think she would have ended up in any different place. I think it would have been the same.
Oh yeah, she has that
Right here.
This just kind of segues onto that, because I had a question when you were talking about today how so few women are recognized. Why is that? You're talking about this first wave of feminism, the 22nd wave in the 70s with the equal rights amendment and all that, and then it seems, and I've been through that, it seems like we've gone backwards. We've gone forward in some respects and backwards in other respects. Is there any theories academically, from an anthropological point of view or a biological point of view? I mean, I can think of some of my own, but I'm just curious as to why we are still seeing some of the same things we've seen forever.
So the question is, as far as women in society, we are still encountering problems that we were facing 100 years ago. Why is that?
Right.
Kay, you want to just stab at that?
Sure. I think we have learned some things. That's a good thing, right? And one of the things is that we learn a lot from looking at other societies and other situations. So the sort of early feminism really was really focused on the U.S. and actually sort of the middle class U.S. And so over time, we've just broadened the set of people that we look at and the kinds of solutions, how they define the problems, and the kinds of social solutions and policy solutions that they saw. And so, as an anthropologist, I think all kinds of transnational occurrence of change influence our questions. And so often the United States is not at the highest level of all the things that might benefit the situation. Really learn from other major countries, but also we don't want to leave out women at the margins. Many of our formulations have just focused on a smaller set of women and their bigger issues. The one thing we look at now is something called intersectionality. A big, long word, but it's not that hard to pronounce. And what that says is it's not just the woman, it's not just a gender issue, but it's all kinds of social identities and experiences and how they interconnect. So that we really want to look at different kinds of inequality or hierarchies of value. A lot of the things we've been talking about tonight have been about who makes the hierarchies of values that we have. And once we've sort of figured out what those hierarchies are, what do we do with those? And that's a more complicated but a more interesting question than just the gender one. So I think the next stage, and this is where I think, in fact, this new stage of feminism, while I don't think they have it quite together, they're not as activist as I would be. But the younger people do have a lot of things together, I have to say. Ones I teach do, certainly do. They are doing very creative thinking. But it's that idea of they're looking at these intersectionalities, the way different dimensions of life cross-cut each other, so that we look at sometimes what we have in common and other times what we have that is contrasting. But the goal has to be to build some kind of coalition, people who agree on what the problems are and want to pursue those, and then to rediscover some kind of activism. There's a part of me that thinks we've lost the social movements. Where are the social movements when we need them? But what I find in my work is that we have coalitions of people who care about the issues, say the Pembroke Center is interested in, and who support us in all different ways. So I think the trick is to find out what the hierarchies of value are that are promoting kinds of change that you think would be great, and what are the ones that stand in the way that are obstacles.
Great. So we only have time for really one more question, or maybe two. Right up here.
Okay, we've got, it sounds like Shaw meets On the Family, because in Shaw, one of his earliest plays is Mrs. Warren's Profession, and you've got Vivi questioning, what does her mother do to make the money to send me to school? What does she do? She's a prostitute. She's a brothel madam. in All in the Family, you've got the women's issues that start coming out, menopause. You've got 5 seconds, now change. Or Gloria having a miscarriage, first time she gets pregnant, or Mike wanting to fool around with his wife with a different identity. That way you can, fool around with me that way. Or them always having an argument about why can't Gloria go to school? She's supporting Mike in that. He can go to school and get his degree by working. Why can't she work until she's ready to almost have her baby?
So yeah, Jerry?
Would it have been, surveying the American academic and medical population as a whole, would it have been possible to assemble on this stage a quartet of male scholars and experts to address the questions that we've been talking about here tonight?
I would hope so. I mean, it's weird that I'm going to answer this, but there's this, I think there are men who are, I mean, it sort of goes back to the question of why are we still in this situation, and I think it has to do with building coalitions that are gender, that it's not about male or female, but that men are also saying that they are feminists. If you have a mom, you should maybe be a feminist, like you have women in your life that you love and care about, and I think I do know that there are men academics who are focused on gender issues and supporting equality, etc. I would think that they, and I'm sure they all agree. Right? I don't know. Do you?
Well, I personally think that we need, as a community, we need a little bit more work on accepting everybody. And it goes beyond gender, of course. And it also goes beyond just where we are and expectations. It also goes beyond life choices. There was a long time when women were brutal with their college classmates who decided to stay home and not go to work. And they worked, and they actually say, well, I don't, or that she doesn't work. Well, it's hard to stay home and take care of the kids and take care of the family, and that it's certainly work. And I hope that we're changing and we're giving respect to those choices. And I think that the same thing is true of men. Men are pretty brutal against men who decide to stay home and take care of the kids right now. Women have gotten a little bit better about treating other women that way than men have. And so I think we all need to work a little bit on that. And I think that some of the gender issues are certainly, you can't get past the biology. Women did choose the short stick when it came to reproduction. We do bear a little bit of a burden for that. But it doesn't have to be the psychological aspect or the parenting aspect. That's more of a choice. And so I think that, again, we should work on respecting those choices.
One more.
One of the critiques of this play is that they threw in an awful lot of stuff into one play. Particularly, I think in our theater discussion class, the fact that they threw in BRCA in a word, and they threw in, there's everything from menopause to breast cancer to genetics to breast cancer to all of this stuff. So, I think, I don't know whether that does a service or a disservice in that it's thrown out there, and I was kind of surprised by the fact that you mentioned estrogen in a better light, because I think most of this audience in here would think that, it's almost like taking poison because you're going to get breast cancer from it. So that did leave that situation. But the other issue that I want to address is anthropologists. My son is an anthropologist, and as the usual anthropology gift, he
gave me a book by Margaret Lockwood on cultural differences in menopause. And I was shocked to find out that there are women that don't get hot flashes. And I know what, in different tribes and different places around the world. And the fact, and one of the issues was the idea of the way the older woman is treated within society. And one of the issues I thought in this play was, you took estrogen because it was the fountain of youth. You didn't think about what it could possibly do. You didn't care really. It was just presented by the pharmaceutical companies as the fountain of youth. And yet in other cultures, that's not what they think. So is menopause a state of mind? Is that all that it is?
No. Okay, that's it. Estrogen drops and women are at risk for heart disease, for sexual dysfunction, and for osteoporosis, which can, with fracture, to be fatal. And estrogen prevents most of that. In 2004, when the Women's Health Initiative came out, it was very scary. It was and there are a lot of reasons that I don't have the time to say, but what we're going to find out is the biggest problem with that study is that it took everyone off estrogen and it deprived the women in the next 6 years in that critical period of getting the benefits that would have happened 10 years after menopause had they taken that. And I think that's going to be, there are going to be some repercussions for that.
I do want to thank the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. I want to thank my panel so much. I literally learned about menstruation from, I grew up in a house full of boys. I learned about it from watching Roseanne. Thank you, Darlene. So this actually has been fascinating and enlightening and incredibly intelligent, and I think we all want to thank you so much for those of you that haven't seen the show, that don't have tickets, our box office is open. You can purchase some tickets for this show, as well as any of the other shows that we have coming out. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you soon.